Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, Donald Trump has threatened Iran, saying time is running out. Keir Starmer visits China, and the AI job apocalypse might already be here, although it is very much disputed. We'll be looking at the debate. I'm Michael Walker, and I'm joined tonight by Aaron Bastani. Great to have you on.
Michael, always a pleasure.
If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. Donald Trump has today made renewed threats to attack Iran. He's posted this on Truth Social. So he says, a massive armada is heading to Iran. It is moving quickly with great power, enthusiasm and purpose. It is a larger fleet headed by the great aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln than that sent to Venezuela. Like with Venezuela, it is ready, willing and able to rapidly fulfill its mission with speed and violence if necessary. Hopefully Iran will quickly come to the table and negotiate a fair and equitable deal. No nuclear weapons. One that is good for all parties. Time is running out. It is truly of the essence. As I told Iran once before, make a deal. They didn't, and there was Operation Midnight Hammer, a major destruction of Iran. The next attack will be far worse. Don't make that happen again. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. So now it's nuclear. I feel like the justifications are constantly changing. So before it was about killing protesters, now it's about nuclear weapons. Obviously, there was an Iran nuclear deal until Trump ripped it up just because Obama had signed the deal. So he's sort of, after putting the country through hell, he's sort of suggesting if they come to the table and sign something like they did with Obama, maybe it'll all be okay. I don't know. Of course, it's difficult to know how seriously to take whatever Donald Trump bashes into his smartphone. But the US does appear to be building up to something quite big. This is from the BBC.
The recent arrival of a fully loaded aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, accompanied by 5 destroyers in the region, certainly provides the president with options. The US already had a significant military presence in the Middle East, with bases in Qatar, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Bahrain. But over the last few weeks, there's been a significant build-up. These include the arrival of more fighter jets, including F-15s, to Jordan and Qatar. The USS Abraham Lincoln alone has around 70 aircraft, including F-35s capable of avoiding enemy radar. Also significant is the arrival of dozens of transport aircraft in the region, some carrying additional air defences.
It's always just, any time I see a list of or a map where it shows you all the places the Americans have air bases, it's just crazy. We're going to be talking about China later, and people sort of saying, China, they want to dominate these other countries. America literally has an air base, everywhere, it seems. The BBC led last night's News at 10 with a report on the number of people believed to have been killed in the Iran protests earlier this month.
The images emerging from Iran paint an ever more horrifying picture. Witnesses say security forces fired live ammunition from motorbikes and rooftops. They speak of massacres, a bloodbath.
No one was violent and no one clashed with the security forces. But on Friday night, they still opened fire on the crowd. We all know someone who was killed in the protests.
One human rights group has already identified more than 6,000 of the dead, almost all protesters, though dozens were simply bystanders and more than 90 were children. And the counting has barely begun. It's investigating reports from its activists on the ground of another 17,000 deaths.
Aaron, I wanted to know your thoughts on this, because I was watching the News at 10 last night, and it is, it's interesting the way that, as it seems like Donald Trump is really preparing for war, all of these Western news agencies are really sort of talking about how many people died. And it seems like, what's this? This seems like a bit of a coincidence. The reason, though, it does seem like we are getting more information about how many people may have died in the protests is because the internet, which has been shut down since the protests, is now being opened up to some degree, partly because it was destroying Iran's economy even more than it was already destroyed. What's your understanding of what's going on here?
Lots of people have died. We know this through just anecdotes as well as anything else. There are people now beginning to establish contact with friends and family, and somebody will say, I have contact with some people who've said, my cousin said that 2 of their friends have been killed, or, a family member's been killed, or a neighbour's, niece has been killed. Lots of people have been killed. That's not really up for debate. The question is how many. The more conservative estimates are saying 3,000.
Well, that's not that's what the Iranian government is saying.
Reuters
3,000.
initially reported that as well. So generally, Reuters is pretty good for this kind of stuff. And I think until you have things which are verified by independent sources, that's where I would sit. Now, we're not going to get independent verification for a very long time. Maybe not for 5, 10, 15 years. God knows when. Eventually, you will. The truth will out, but in the short to medium term, you won't get that. It's really important to say that 3,000 deaths is far more than Tiananmen Square. In itself, that is extraordinary. That's a bloodbath, right? Now the question of 15, 30,000, etc. We're journalists. We want to relay facts to people. I've had so many people message me, primarily Iranians, in the diaspora, saying, "Why are you saying 30,000 people have died?" And all I can say in response is, I don't know how many people have died. It could be more than that. I couldn't even get contact with my family members until today. So I find it hard to believe that many of these people making contact with people in Iran weeks ago, I don't believe most of those people. In recent days, that's different. As you've said, we're getting more and more information now by the hour. So 3,000 people being killed is more than enough to say that a government should go. There was a point there made about that no one was violent. That was said on that BBC report. There has been violence from protesters. There has been. And by the way, if you have a tyrannical regime and you want to get rid of it, it's permissible to be violent, right? But we've seen, for instance, firebombing and arson of places like libraries and civic centres and mosques. That has happened, right? That has happened. That doesn't mean that people should be killed as a result, but it has happened. Again, we're journalists. We're here to relay the facts. That person said something on the BBC which wasn't corrected, which we know wasn't true.
So I suppose she was speaking about the specific protest she was on. But yeah, they could have added context and say that it does seem like on other protests, at least, there was some violence.
There has been. And it doesn't mean that you should kill anybody. Of course you shouldn't. But it's important to relay all the facts. I've already said 3,000 people, conservative estimate, have been killed. In and of itself, that's enough to delegitimize any government, anywhere on earth. In terms of where this intersects now with the White House and with the US military, the cornerstone of Iran's self-defense doctrine in this part of the world has been threats of closing down the Straits of Hormuz, where about 20% of global oil goes through. Now, they said in 2012, if you sanction our central bank, we'll shut down the Straits of Hormuz. Guess what? Over the last 14 years, it's been sanctioned. The Straits of Hormuz is just fine. Thank you very much. And I suspect the Americans think that there's a lot more bark than bite with the Iranians now. Their capability has been so massively degraded by Israel, the 12-day war, the loss of proxies, the sanctions. And so that government, that regime, that state is weaker by the day. What they'll do now, I suspect, is some kind of limited military intervention. There'll be some kind of naval blockade to further throttle the country's economy and its ability to get oil exports out of the country and to go to places like China via a place like Pakistan. And who knows? All of this is based on one of two things happening. Either the government falls because of pressure from the Straits. That doesn't seem to be happening because it's very willing to use violence. Or there'll be some kind of internal coup. That's a huge presumption. It doesn't seem at the moment that the US is committed to actually sending ground forces into Iran, which, by the way, would be very, I think, unwise. So if there isn't a coup, it just feels like there's going to be infinity sanctions, infinity blockades, infinity protests, infinity people being killed on protests. And that just takes the country towards being a failed state. And that's the thing I'm really worried about. And I think it's very plausible. And lots of Iranians will be watching this and be really critical of me. They're saying, how dare you? We've got no other choice. Iran could become Syria. It can become Afghanistan. It can. And, you do not want that to happen because the solution in Syria, the solution in Afghanistan was millions of deaths. And guess what? The bad guys won anyway. So that's my worry, is that since 1979, things in Iran just get worse and worse and worse and worse. And there's no guarantee that they start to get better. Things can always get worse.
And I suppose it's just one of those situations where having the response as tightening sanctions just does seem completely immoral, because the only mechanism by which tightening sanctions brings down the regime is if it provokes protests. So then you're just if you're living in an authoritarian regime, you're already in this difficult situation, which is that do you keep your head down and sort of keep things ticking, or do you protest and risk your life? Now, obviously, if the economy's fine and you're not particularly political, you're probably going to keep your head down and sort of see how you can get on. But if you've introduced those sanctions, then your choice just gets much harder, and you've got to risk your life or continue in poverty.
Yeah.
And that's the express purpose of sanctions, I suppose, is to put citizens in that dreadful bind.
They don't work. They've worked once, and that was with regards to South Africa, and that was a government which viewed itself as trying to create a developed country, which viewed itself as really a Western country, harboured ambitions of being at least West adjacent, right? Nuclear weapons program, middle income GDP, highly educated for white South Africans. Apart from that, there's been no example of sanctions working. And I don't think they'll work here. If you were to say, look, where's your money? It's Iran becoming a failed state. Now, I'm not that familiar with, elements within the Revolutionary Guard who might be willing to do a deal. Of course, Khamenei is very old. The succession there is a major variable in all of this. But if you look at all the parts, you look at the historical context, you look at the precedents, history is a great teacher, right? I think the end game here is really a failed state. I think it's something like Syria. And Iranians like to think they're special. No country is special. In the 17th century, Europe had civil wars that killed more people comparatively than the Second World War. Germany's 30 Years' War killed more people than Germany lost in the Second World War. Europe was not immune from these things. Why should Iran be immune from these things?
Keir Starmer has today landed in Beijing, a destination which has become increasingly popular among Western leaders. In the past 2 months, both Emmanuel Macron and Mark Carney have travelled to China, and Germany's Friedrich Merz is scheduled to make his own visit next month. All these leaders have one thing in common. They've been burned by Trump blowing up the global trading regime, which they'd all got used to, and then threatening America's NATO allies. That means now they're seeking to broaden their friendship group. Starmer is leading a delegation which includes 60 business leaders, including from British Airways, AstraZeneca, and the Natural History Museum. And on arrival, Starmer said this.
It is in our national interest to engage with China. It's the second biggest economy in the world. If you take Hong Kong alongside China, it's our third biggest trading partner. There are huge opportunities to be had in lots of different sectors. And we see that reflected in the delegation that we've got, because we've got the very best that we're bringing from the United Kingdom in business, in sport, in culture, in art. What we're doing here is engaging and building a comprehensive, consistent, stable, strategic approach to China, which is much needed, has huge opportunities. And for me, the most important thing, as ever, is to be absolutely determined that this will deliver back into the United Kingdom.
Starmer will be meeting Xi Jinping and Premier Li Qiang tomorrow, so we'll learn about any political deals then. Some of the business leaders on the trip have been speaking to the press in the meantime, though. Greg Jackson is the founder and CEO of Octopus Energy.
We do buy Chinese equipment. Undeniably, Chinese electric cars really are cutting-edge technology, as an example, and our customers are buying them. So Octopus leases electric cars to its customers. So we lease thousands of Chinese electric cars alongside many others. But also, Chinese technology in batteries, is an absolute game changer in energy. Chinese solar panels are eye-wateringly cheap, not because of cheap labour anymore, not because of subsidies, but because they've invested so much in technology research and development. And of course, you mentioned Chinese wind turbines, which, again, they've invested so much in research and development. There are some that are better than you'll buy in the West.
We spoke to Sir Richard Dearlove, former head of MI6, on the programme yesterday, he says, I'm not an isolationist, but we shouldn't be reliant on China or having any sort of Chinese involvement in our critical national infrastructure. He used the example of cars that can be switched off. And to have Octopus Energy, which obviously is sort of such an important energy supplier, talking about wanting what sounds like a very close partnership with China, makes one wonder whether there aren't ways in which there could be some future threat from that.
And Sir Richard Dearlove was bang right. We cannot be naive in dealing with not only China, but other countries generally. And I think, for example, some of the work we've done is how do you isolate the firmware, the stuff that controls the hardware, from the hardware? Because everyone has got phones and laptops made in China. Every conversation, every bank transaction is going through that kit. We have to find ways to make all of this equipment secure.
Aaron, I mean, the press around this has been funny because the situation seems to be Keir Starmer wants to sort of warm to China. All the businesses want to warm to China. And then the media, along with Kemi Badenoch, who we'll get onto in a moment, are sort of saying, should we be doing this? Should we trust the Chinese? What do you make of this trip?
Well, it's nice to hear somebody who's sensible and pragmatic, actually, for once. This idea that, there could be a kill switch in Chinese EVs. Well, first of all, it's just a car, right? Ultimately, it's just a car. F-35s have kill switches, right? We'd be using them in war. The Americans probably build those with kill switches. As I've said before, we probably know that they have kill switches. We just don't really want to talk about it. The Trident missiles probably have kill switches. We just don't want to talk about it. That's stuff that is literally life or death, right? Huawei, that's a bit different because, of course, it's national infrastructure where everybody's using it. But the idea that I might be driving my EV and then, Xi Jinping will say, Michael Walker's car must drive into Boris Johnson. It's fantastical. It's fantastical. All of this technology has kill switches. As we know now, because you had the John Deere tractors, which were in Ukraine, at the start of the Russian-Ukraine war, the Russians seized a ton of them, took them back to Russia. John Deere company in the United States, one of the world's most prestigious manufacturers of our agricultural technologies, turned on the kill switch. Doesn't work anymore. Teslas have them. So he's right. All technologies have this, and you want to be able to disaggregate the firmware from the hardware. Do we want to depend on China? Absolutely not. Do we want to depend on the United States? Absolutely not. Do we want to depend on Russia? Absolutely not. But you've got to, if you want to reindustrialize, you've got to work with one of these three players, right? Russia gives you cheap energy. The US gives you cutting-edge digital technology. But in terms of actually producing industrial goods, or getting cheap industrial goods, China is unsurpassed, right? What is Britain really bad at right now, Michael? I would say two things. It's really bad at building houses, and it's really bad at building cheap infrastructure. Really bad. From, nuclear power stations to 5G to high-speed rail. Guess what the Chinese are really good at? Really good at. So I would frankly like a lot more cooperation with China in those areas. We sell very little to China. I saw a tweet by the Reform candidate for Hampshire mayoralty, and he says, we sell all this, to America, and we sell very little to China. Well, given by some measures, it's the world's largest market, it's the world's number one economy, if you look at GDP, PPP, surely then it's a huge opportunity. We sell all this stuff to the US. We don't sell that much to China. Chinese people seem to really like British goods, right? They like their Burberry Macs. They seem to like the luxury cars. They like Jaguar Land Rover. Let's get that up. They like going to Premier League football matches. We could probably export more, right? And here's where it's interesting, Michael. I know we'll talk about Kemi Badenoch in a minute. But the right don't want to spend money on public infrastructure. They don't want people to have free education. They don't want to tax people in this country to build stuff. They don't want to build stuff full stop because they're NIMBYs. I'm talking about the Tory party here. They don't want to export stuff to China. They don't want closer trading relations with Europe. What do they want? Tell me what you want. What is your plan for growth? What is your plan for the economy? They don't have one. No. Culture war. They're not serious people. They are not serious people. And that's how bad it is. British business is lining up alongside people like me who wrote a book about communism because we're saying you've got to be realistic. It's a huge global market. They can help us in areas where we're particularly weak. Let's get on with it.
Let's go to Kemi Badenoch's argument. So the Tories, as you'd imagine, they're attacking Starmer for this trip. Kemi Badenoch has written in the Telegraph that Starmer is kowtowing to China and complains Starmer gave away the UK's leverage before boarding the plane to Beijing. She said this at a press conference earlier today.
You asked, would I be going to China? No, not now, because I don't think that this is the time to do that. We need to be talking to those other countries who are worried about the threat China is posing to them. When I was trade secretary at the World Trade Organization, Japan, Australia, Brazil, all suffering economic coercion, European countries. We should be talking more to those countries who are aligned with our interests, not the country that is doing everything it can to undermine our economy. I think that that is what our Prime Minister should be talking about, and he needs to show strength, not approving a super embassy, which many people think is going to become a spy hub. He looks like he gives way every time things get difficult, and that is the difference between Keir Starmer and myself.
So her argument is that Keir Starmer shouldn't have approved this new Chinese embassy. The argument is that could have been some leverage he could have used in China to try and get some deals. Say, we'll do X, Y, Z. I think they want to get Jimmy Lai free, who was a newspaper magnate in Hong Kong. We'll approve it if you do this for us. Now, from what I'd read, they would only invite Starmer once he'd approved it. So I think there is a danger of Kemi Badenoch exaggerating the leverage any British leader might have. Also, this idea, Kemi Badenoch basically just sounds like a politician from 4 years ago, because she's saying China practices economic coercion. We couldn't possibly do a deal with them. Like, who is the leader who's constantly tweeting that if you don't do X, Y, Z, I'm going to put 25% tariffs on you or 50% tariffs on you? It's not someone in Beijing.
Michael, what is, I don't know what that means. What does economic coercion mean?
Yeah, I'm not sure what it means in that context. The argument made against China is that they invest in countries and then invest in sort of poorer countries and then use that as leverage. But that's what every country does.
But they make loans and then they want the loan back. You might not think that's a nice thing. I get it, right? But that's not outlandish.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the economic coercion sort of means in that context.
Here's an interesting stat, Michael. BYD, which is the leading Chinese brand of electric vehicles, there are no tariffs on Chinese vehicles in this country, right? There were 100% tariffs in Canada. They've now gone down to 6% for the first 49,000 vehicles. There are no tariffs in this country on BYD cars. BYD cars and orders for them over 12 months last year went up 880%. Why? Because they're good. They're good cars. They're cheap. They're cheap to run. It's really not that difficult, but she's saying this is economic coercion. They're good. It's good. People want good, cheap stuff. Now, I understand in certain sectors of the economy, you don't want big vulnerabilities. I totally get it. But I want cheap EVs. I want cheap lithium batteries. That's not coercive.
Yeah, that's also, because, there is an argument that China dump. So dumping, again, is not really the right word for it, but there is an argument that they are so interested in sort of exports and suppressing domestic demand that means that they have these massive trade surpluses, which does help to deindustrialize other countries. It's a similar argument that was made by the Greeks or Yanis Varoufakis about Germany in the 2010s. It's not like a right-wing argument. But yeah, economic coercion seems to me specifically like you're saying, we are going to use the economy to make you do something you otherwise wouldn't do.
You have to buy BYD.
Which is what Donald Trump is doing. He's saying, if you don't do this, then I will put sanctions on you. I'm not actually aware of what that would apply to when it comes to China. Let's go to another hawk, Ian Duncan Smith.
This is a country that has attacked the UK endlessly on cyber stuff. Having been sanctioned, I have wolf warriors that have pursued me. The whole thing goes on and on and on. They talk, but they always never lose sight of what their purpose in life is: to dominate the country that they're involved in, to make it so that they are so dependent that they can't dare change anything. We are, as I said before, very weak at the moment. Our economy is not in good shape. The government's made a whole series of mistakes. And now they're running to China in the hope, on bended knee, of getting growth. And China's not interested in our goods. They're not interested in our physical exports at all. We have such a deficit. It's remarkable. The only thing we can get to them is financial trade, but that's already open. The key problem we've got here is the dumping that will take place and the penetration of so many of our organizations. Security services are very, very worried about what comes next. And by the way, Canada has gone over to China and come back with an appalling trade arrangement. And America is almost certainly going to tariff Canadian goods. Do we want that in return from our biggest market in the US?
So that was a strange answer, because within a minute, right, he's sort of accused China of economic coercion and sort of using their strong economy to try and dominate other countries. And then he's ended it by saying, also, we don't want to be like Canada, who signed this mutually beneficial trade deal with China and then was sanctioned by their neighbor, the United States. That is the example of economic coercion. Now, obviously, every country is going to be acting in its own interests. Like, China isn't going to sign a trade deal with us or strike investment deals out of the good of its heart. Ideally, what you want is for these to be mutually beneficial, right? You don't want to get exploited. You want to retain some independence in key areas. But the country practicing economic coercion right now, again, it's not China.
No. I mean, also he's saying our economy is in a bit of a mess at the moment. Yeah, who's responsible for that, Ian? You know, in 2005-06, Michael, we had a complete refit of this country's digital networks. BT had a bunch of contracts out to tender, broadband and whatnot. I think 8 companies ultimately won those contracts. Not a single one was British. And at the time, Marconi was a major company. It could have, had it continued to today, that could be one of the major players in global 5G. You've got 3 companies that can do it, Nokia, Ericsson and Huawei. But we decided to not give a contract to any British firms, and so guess what? It died. Marconi was bought by, I think it was bought by Ericsson later that year. So you've had politicians in this country for decades not supporting British industry, happy for us to deindustrialise, and now they're saying we can't be dependent on overseas countries when it comes to manufactured goods and infrastructure. Again, which one do you want? You wanted an economy built on the service industries, built on finance, built on real estate, not built on making things because that's the past. Get with the future, modernise. Those are old ideas. Turns out that was a load of crap. And now they're saying, well, actually, what do you want? Who should make the stuff? Who should make the stuff? The Americans aren't making cheap cars. They're not really making cheap cars. They're not building 5G. There's not a single American company that builds 5G. American companies can't build high-speed rail. You don't want it to be British companies. Who's meant to make this stuff? You don't want it to be the European companies because we just left the EU. It's just not real. None of it's real. It's not real politics. It's just constant gesturing and performance. Now, you could have a position which is we should be close to the Europeans and, French companies and German companies. I wouldn't agree with it, but it's coherent, right? Or you can say we need to hug the Americans tight and we need to reindustrialize in these areas. And, again, it's coherent. The Tories don't say that. The Tories aren't saying let's have national champions in these particular fields and be really close to the Americans because it's really important with regards to military and foreign policy aims, right? You could say that. And at the same time, let's move away from Trident and have the missiles built here. That'd be a sensible centre-right position. They don't say that because it's all performance and nonsense. Kemi Badenoch won't go to China? Really? You want to govern this country, but you won't go to one of the most powerful countries in the world? And Ian Duncan Smith is saying, why are these people on a trade mission to China when they don't buy many of our goods? You've answered your own question. They're on a trade mission to China because China doesn't buy many of our goods and services. That's literally why they are there. It's an opportunity we're not taking. These are not serious people. The Conservative Party deserves to die. It is the least serious organisation in the country, staffed with and filled with the least serious people in politics. They're entirely responsible for the state of this country after the last 15 years.
Let's take a quick look at the UK approach to China and how it has changed, because I suppose to be fair to them, which I don't normally say, David Cameron and George Osborne in the 2010s did have somewhat of a coherent China policy, because sort of one of the options you just said there is they say, we won't make any things anymore. We'll be a service economy. China is a rising power. We'll do their finances and get them to build our nuclear plants. And that was their plan. So they courted China intensely. Cameron and Xi Jinping appeared to bond while sinking pints, on a state visit to the UK. That sort of image became quite famous. The two leaders also gave a joint press conference from Downing Street where David Cameron said this.
So this visit marks the start of a new era. Some have called it a golden era in relations between Britain and China, an era of stronger economic ties, deeper trade links, closer relations between our peoples, and meaningful dialogue on the issues that matter to us both. And all of this is rooted in a relationship between our two old countries, a relationship fit for the 21st century, benefiting not just our nations and our peoples, but also the wider world.
So some of the key elements of this golden age in UK-China relations were Chinese investment in UK infrastructure, so most notably in a nuclear power plant at Hinkley Point. London, the key idea was that we would be China's financial gateway to the West. Of course, Cameron and Osborne trying to reinvigorate the city of London after the financial crisis. However, by the late 2010s, attitudes were beginning to change. So Trump's election in 2016, of course, created a new bipartisan hawkishness in Washington. So he was very anti-China, but then the moment he became president, actually the Democrats also became quite anti-China. Some would argue that wasn't just because of changes in Washington, it was also because China had changed. So Xi Jinping, many people would say, had become a bit more authoritarian. There was a crackdown in Hong Kong, which damaged its international reputation. And then in July 2020, this happened.
Huawei moved early and at speed on Britain's telecoms market. Winning 5G contracts here with an American ally would give confidence to other markets to buy Chinese. Today, the government blew a hole in that strategy.
We have concluded that it is necessary and indeed prudent to commit to a timetable for the removal of Huawei equipment from our 5G network by 2027.
5G is conceived for a super-connected and super-intelligent world.
It's only 6 months since the government said it could live with Huawei operating 5G. What changed, the government said, was American sanctions against China. Huawei now can't use American semiconductors. The security services here say that means they can't be sure what tricks the technology may be playing on us.
It is a fact that the US has introduced additional sanctions on Huawei, and as facts have changed, so has our approach.
Aaron, I know you've been reading about Huawei at the moment. Talk about the significance of that decision by the UK to ban it from British infrastructure and whether that was a mistake.
Well, for people watching or listening, maybe you have 5G on your phone. I would ask a simple question. Does it work? Is it very good? That decision at the time was projected to cost the UK 2 billion at the time, 6 years ago. And the projection was it would push back widespread adoption of 5G by 2 to 3 years. I think that was a massive underestimate, actually. And I think we probably won't ever adopt 5G as widely as we thought we were going to. I think 6G will be online before we widely adopt 5G. 5G, of course, has a ton of use cases, particularly for the Internet of Things, particularly for EVs. You might think, I don't want 5G, whatever. The point is, we're meant to be committed to that as part of a transition to a different kind of economy. Equally, if you want Androids, a lot of these machines you're now seeing made by Tesla and whatnot, they will be really needing 5G to work. So, and probably 6G. So it's a very important technology if you think that's the next sort of field of economic endeavor. It cost us money and time. They acknowledged that then. And I personally don't think it means we'll never actually adopt this 5G like we could have. Other countries in Europe still have it. The alternatives were not.
Other countries in Europe still have Huawei?
I think Spain still has it. You'd have to double check, but I'm pretty sure Spain still has it. If you look at the other companies that are capable of building 5G, you've got Nokia, you've got Ericsson. There are European alternatives. But there was a great speech given by, I think it was the chief network engineer at BT, maybe about 10 years ago, and he said that Huawei was just the undisputed number one when it came to 5G. They were the market leader. So we've intentionally chosen second best. We've intentionally chosen for it to cost money. We've intentionally chosen to not deploy it at scale. I have said it's a sensible move now. If you're not going to get Huawei back in, to at least do some kind of cooperation agreement with Chinese engineers to help Nokia and Ericsson. And of course, the argument there wasn't about geopolitics. We can't trust Huawei. The argument was partly technology, partly geopolitics. They can't access the microprocessors because they're not going to be able to get it from America or American-favored companies and countries like Taiwan, TSMC. So they can't do this anymore. That's kind of changing now. So if you wanted to do it, probably in a few years, you could do it. Huawei have their own in-house microprocessor production. That's now surprisingly good. It's not on a par with TSMC and Samsung, which are Taiwanese and from South Korea, but it's surprisingly good. The point of these sanctions and the point of arresting the daughter of the CEO of Huawei, her name is Meng Wanzhou, the point of all that was to destroy Huawei as a strategic company that's very important for China and Chinese technology. It didn't work. It survived. And I think when Britain did this in 2020, the presumption was from the political class and from all the briefings, Huawei won't exist anymore. We're going to kill it. That hasn't worked. And I'd add one more thing as well, Michael. You know, what changed from Cameron to now? Yes, the election of Trump. Yes, Xi Jinping is a very different kind of leader to somebody like Hu Jintao, who was just pro-markets and, basically just quite pro-capitalism.
But also had, from people who lived in China at the time, they said it was a period of opening up.
Yeah.
So sort of there were human rights NGOs.
Yeah.
It was a more cosmopolitan place, a more socially liberal place. So I don't think it's just that, it's become more socialist now. It has become more authoritarian.
Well, I mean, I think it's probably both. If you look at, I don't want to get into Xi Jinping thought for a new era with, Chinese characteristics. Xi Jinping thought with Chinese characteristics for a new era is the official branding. They would say it is more turned back to socialism, but we can part.
No, I would say it's not just more back. I'd say it probably is more socialist, but it's also more authoritarian, more socially conservative. And I mean, lots of people who lived there 10 years ago say it's changed for the worse.
Yeah. Well, so Hu Jintao, the guy I mentioned before, he was the premier guy at the 2008 Beijing Olympics. And, people looked at Hu Jintao, they looked at China, and basically this narrative of they'll join the WTO in 2000, they'll open up to the global economy, they'll become integrated within global production, they'll become more like us, they might even have multi-party democracy, which always sounds kind of crazy when you think about it. But, in 2008 with Hu Jintao, you can kind of believe it, right? And like you say, since then, that's become less credible. It's not credible at all, Xi Jinping. But I think the thing we've not mentioned is that alongside the political changes, alongside the arrival of Trump, is the fact that China did something which not many people were expecting, at least not this quickly, which was moving up global commodity chains. China was really good at making cheap stuff really cheap, even more cheap. And it got better and better and better at making things like consumer durables. So it's moving from children's toys to drills to laptops, things like that. And now in the last 6-7 years, it's moving into things like lithium-ion batteries, electric vehicles, 5G. It's really going into frontier technologies, which actually, in some ways, like the in-car technology of EVs in China, so I'm told, are better than the ones that non-Chinese companies produce, like Tesla. And I think that's also a major variable, is that all of a sudden, in increasingly large bits of the economy, China is making better products than the West is. And that's really worrying, because the presumption always was, let them make stuff because, the top tier, high knowledge intensive stuff will never be as good as ours. That bet's turned out to be wrong.
The way the thing I hadn't realized, which is sort of remiss on my part, I hadn't realized that the alternative to Huawei were two European countries, Ericsson and Nokia, Ericsson from Sweden, Nokia from Finland. Because, but I had in my head that sort of we'd kicked out Huawei and probably some American firm had come in and now we're just more reliant on the Americans. But if we kicked out Huawei and then we got 5G a little bit slower, right? And it was, the coverage wasn't quite so good, but we helped build up two European sort of engineering powerhouses. I would say that probably was a good thing, right? We're always complaining about how Europe has no technological sovereignty. Obviously, don't switch the Chinese tech for American tech. But if you're switching the Chinese tech for Swedish and Finnish tech, is that, even if it means that you get the benefits of it slightly more slowly, that doesn't seem, that against the kind of thing we're often talking about on this show.
But it wasn't just, okay, let's stop installing this stuff and let's start installing this other stuff. It was saying we have to, all of the stuff that's already been integrated into the network has to be removed. So when you're trying to literally build the network, they're actually deconstructing a network, right? Which is why it's cost $2 billion and it's going to push back the delivery time of 5G 2 to 3 years. I think it's probably 10 years. That's why. And look, then you've got COVID. Then you've got obviously Brexit with greater barriers to European trade. You've got a shortfall with regards to engineering talent. So there's lots of variables there. It wasn't as simple as that. But I do agree with you in principle. When they put those contracts out, Michael, if I had a time machine and go back to 2006, I would say make Marconi Electric a national champion. Let them build 5G in this country, even if it's loss making. Have the state own 50% of the company. Like the French did with a ton of companies. And by the way, it's not just Marconi that didn't do 5G. The French had Alcatel that could have done 5G. The Canadians, I think, had Nortel. That was the leading North American company that could have done this stuff. They all died because here's the thing. There was this orthodoxy of global trade, right? WTO, post-2000. We'll make lattes and sell university degrees and, building stuff is for East Asians. And actually, over time, people think, shit, that was a really big mistake. But it had buy-in from everybody in politics, everybody. Republicans, Democrats, Labour, Tories.
Workers everywhere are worried about AI replacing their jobs. And a new study suggests jobs are being hardest hit in the United Kingdom. And the study is by the investment bank Morgan Stanley. It's reported in Bloomberg. The research was based on a survey of firms that have been using AI for at least a year in 5 industries exposed to the technology. So they've classed that as retail, real estate, transport, healthcare equipment, and automobiles, very broad categories. Among that set of companies, so just among this sort of select set of companies, UK firms reported a net loss of 8% of jobs. In the US, AI also caused the destruction of some jobs, but that was outweighed by the creation of a larger amount of other jobs, which apparently are also related to AI. So according to Bloomberg, AI has created more jobs than it's destroyed in America, while in the UK, it's destroyed a lot more jobs than it has created. The Bloomberg article links the difference between the UK and the US to slower growth and higher labour costs in the UK compared to the United States. This is what they say. UK companies saw an average 11.5% productivity increase thanks to AI, with almost half reporting even greater boosts. But their US counterparts, which reported virtually the same productivity gains, created more jobs than they slashed due to AI. In the UK, the AI revolution comes just as employers are struggling with payroll costs, slow growth, and greater political instability. Firms are cutting jobs at the fastest pace since 2020, and unemployment is at a near 5-year high, according to the latest official statistics, as large minimum wage rises and an increase in national insurance contributions continue to impact staffing plans. So the argument here from Morgan Stanley and Bloomberg is essentially that in the companies which have been using AI, it has massively increased productivity in the United States, where they've got high levels of growth and flexible labor markets. That has meant that those companies have decided, great, we've got increased productivity, we can employ some people in, different parts of the business, now that we don't need them in, this or that part of the business. And in the UK, companies have just said, great, this is a way to save money, essentially. Worryingly, the jobs that companies are reporting are most likely to go, so this is in this sort of survey done by Morgan Stanley, are entry-level ones. So tech firms need fewer junior programmers, as the senior ones can work with Claude Code. Legal firms need fewer paralegals, as that work can be done by ChatGPT. So the argument goes. In the UK, at least, youth unemployment is on the rise. So from a low of 7.2% in August 2022, unemployment of those between 18 and 24 has hit 14%. So almost double what it was just 3 years ago. Overall job vacancies are also down by 26% since 2022. And for jobs where AI has the biggest impact, like consultancy or programming, the fall has been steeper, dropping 37%. So how should we respond? Well, there is a positive angle. Britain has long had a productivity crisis, so artificial intelligence coming along and reversing that, solving the productivity puzzle, that would be a good thing. Just last week, Bloomberg reported on another study, this time from the Resolution Foundation, that suggested that there was a surprise surge in productivity, which could signal an economic turnaround for the country. However, if you just lost your job, or if you're a graduate struggling to find one, because there's no vacancies, because the senior lawyer is using ChatGPT instead of you, strong productivity figures might not provide much solace. What's more, if you were to believe the AI bosses, the transformation is about to speed up. Dario Amodei, and we've shown you him before, CEO of Anthropic. They make Claude and Claude Code. He was at Davos last week.
I even see it within Anthropic, where I can look forward. I can kind of look forward to a time where, on the more junior end, and then on the more intermediate end, we actually need less and not more people. And we're thinking about how to deal with that within Anthropic in a sensible way. 1 to 5 years as of 6 months ago, I would stick with that. If you kind of connect this to what I said before, which is we might have AI that's better than humans at everything in maybe 1 to 2 years, maybe a little longer than that. Those don't seem to line up. The reason is that there's this lag, and there's this replacement thing, right? I know that the labor market is adaptable, right? It's just like 80% of people used to do farming. Farming got automated, and then they became factory workers and then knowledge workers. So, there is some level of adaptability here as well, right? We should be economically sophisticated about how the labor market works. But my worry is, as this exponential keeps compounding, and I don't think it's going to take that long, again, somewhere between a year and 5 years, it will overwhelm our ability to adapt.
So the exponential he's talking about is he thinks that once you automate coding, then your automated coding will improve the AI model, and you have this sort of self-reinforcing spiral, I suppose, upwards. And to be fair to him, Claude Code does seem to be the sort of product which is helping people most in their jobs, right? Engineers or data engineers or whatever, they say is genuinely very useful. Obviously, I'm not particularly in a position to judge. Aaron, what do you think here? I mean, there's two ways of looking at it, right? Because we do always say on this show, the UK has a productivity crisis. It's because we don't invest, we don't upgrade technology enough, we rely on cheap labor, and that means that companies have no incentive to sort of upgrade. According to this Morgan Stanley study, in the firms they spoke to, productivity is up 11% in a year thanks to AI. So in theory, that should mean that growth is going to come back and we're all going to get richer.
Well, it depends. Productivity increased massively in the mid-19th century, but it didn't feed into higher wages for about 40 years. It's called the Engels pause. So you get the Industrial Revolution, obviously right at the beginning of the 19th century, really after the Napoleonic Wars, and it doesn't actually feed into higher living standards for a really long time. So workers getting a share of those productivity gains is the big question. You can have massive productivity gains, but if they're all going to the top 1% or 5% or 0.1%, it doesn't matter. And that's kind of where I think we're going at the moment. I don't think it's quite the top 1%, it's top 5% asset owners, etc. Big asset owners. Maybe it's a bit bigger in some countries, a bit smaller in others. In terms of the productivity, why is this happening now? I think it's not just AI. One, we had interest rate hikes. So the cost of borrowing for zombie firms who are dependent on basically cheap or free credit, they're constantly refinancing their debts. All of a sudden, that refinancing got a lot more expensive. They couldn't refinance, they went bust. Those were zombie unproductive firms. That's one reason. Two, we've made the cost of labor more expensive with the employer national insurance hike. That meant lots of people who would have been hired weren't hired. And people are saying, well, you know what, rather than hire a new person, what can we do to make our existing staff more productive? Investment in capital infrastructure, new workflows. Maybe you've gotten rid of 2 part-time roles and have 1 full-time person, things like that. And then you've got the AI. So, I mean, I don't know where it fits in all that, but it clearly does add to productivity. I think it's an extraordinary technology. Certainly in our game, in media, it's extraordinary. It is extraordinary. And I think in 5 years, it's going to completely transform media to the extent that it will be comparable to 25 years ago when people had newspapers and they're saying, well, people will get their news online. It changed the entire economic model, informational model of journalism. I think for the worse, by the way. Didn't change it for the better, but it changed it. And I think we're going to see something with generative AI. At the same time, when people talk like that, it's because they have something to sell. They've got a company, they've got valuations, they've got shareholders, they've got investors, they've got VC. That's why they say that stuff. But I think it's coming. I think 1 to 5 years is quite ambitious. I'm not Jan LeCun, I'm not Geoffrey Hinton. I don't know. It seems quite ambitious. And this whole idea of, takeoff and the J curve of recurring intelligence that can improve itself, who knows? But the improvements we've seen already in the last 3 to 4 years are striking. And if that's repeated, then clearly in knowledge-intensive industries, we're going to see huge shifts.
What's that? It's called the Engels gap?
Engels pause.
The Engels pause, sorry. So the idea of the Engels pause is that you have this huge increase in productivity at the end of the 19th century.
Start of the 19th century.
Start of the 19th century. But for a while, all the benefits are going to the factory owners and maybe also the landlords.
Correct.
And then the reason that later on that begins to get distributed is presumably because of trade union activism and because you've got quite powerful workers in those factories.
Not just that. I mean, you have the Shaftesbury Acts in this country, which is patrician liberals saying we shouldn't have children working in literal factories. So partly liberal patricians, it's partly trade unions. And then, that's what changes it. As I understand it, Michael, basically people who are, say, weavers, right, in rural Staffordshire in the 18th century were taller and healthier and had stronger bones than people who would have been working in factories in Staffordshire in, say, the 1830s, 1840s. They were healthier people. They lived longer. They were taller. So people literally diminished in size at the start of the Industrial Revolution. So you have a productivity takeoff, but in terms of human health, it was a catastrophe. And then it gradually gets better after the 1840s.
Until it massively overtakes those weavers, right? So
that's right.
There's a period where it gets worse and then it gets massively better. So in the in the long run, we're all better off. But I suppose there's two questions.
We were better off. I mean, there's no, it's not deterministic. It happened because people did stuff, right?
Yeah, no, I mean the future being now.
Right,
Obviously,
yeah.
we don't know what happens in the future, but the future for them being now,
Yeah.
we're better off. So I suppose that there's two questions then, isn't there? Which is, one, that would have been much better if we did it without the Engels pause,
Right.
because for all those people who got, whose industries were destroyed, weaving or whatever, and then went to factories and had terrible lives. I mean, it's all very well saying in the long run it worked out okay, but in the long run we're all famously dead. So for them, it would have been good if we could speed up the process whereby the productivity gains were distributed. The other issue, which I suppose is so that's the sort of positive one. How do we do it without that? The pessimistic one is to say the conditions which allowed for that Engels pause to come to an end, which were sort of a powerful workforce, are no longer there. So maybe we would have an Engels pause now that never ends.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think so.
Which one do you think, though?
I think it's the second.
You think we'll have an Engels pause that never ends?
Have you seen, I'm sure you have, what's that film with Matt Damon? Elysium.
I haven't.
Have you seen it?
No.
Not seen it? So Elysium is this future where the elite live off planet. They have these incredible bits of biotechnological kit, which they've conquered death and aging. Meanwhile, on Earth, people are basically living in these irradiated, environmentally destroyed cities. So you have this incredible technology, but the question is about rights of access. And only a small minority of people get to access that technology. I kind of think that's where people like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk want us to go. I kind of feel that way. I mean, I don't know. Maybe Elon Musk wants to democratize it to some extent more than Peter Thiel. I mean, Peter Thiel overtly wants to go back to a kind of feudal set of social relations coupled with AI. I mean, plausibly, right? I mean, I know it sounds like science fiction nonsense, but the thing is, Michael, I was talking about all of this in my book, which was published in 2018. All of it. And I said, white-collar jobs will be the first to go. Lo and behold. So these are really important conversations for the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Let's go to some skepticism about this. I suddenly lost my train of thought. That's what I was going to say. In terms of the patrician, I suppose there's if you were saying there were patrician liberals that also helped sort of end the Engels pause, I suppose now that would be the weird effective altruists, wouldn't it? So the sort of, because there are lots of people in Silicon Valley at the top of this industry, I'm sure Dario Amodei is one of them, who would say, yes, we know this industry is going to be completely transformative, and actually it just so happens that we're very enlightened, benevolent people.
Yeah.
And so we will use our power at the head of these companies to make sure this technology does benefit everyone. And that's a story they'll be telling. And I think among some of them, it's sincere. I don't know which ones. I mean, there are some effective altruists in Silicon Valley who I think are really sincere people who want everyone to live high quality lives. And their social groups definitely intersect with people who are very high up in these AI companies. But it does seem that as soon as you become a CEO of an AI company, you become a bit of a psychopath.
Well, Sam Altman is a great example here, right? The CEO of OpenAI. If you were hearing what he had to say in 2015, 2016, it was Star Trek communism. We have to manage this technology. It's going to disrupt everything. We have to do it in a way which accommodates the public interest. And now, we have to stop a singularity. And if we do, it has to be managed. And Dario Amodei was at OpenAI, Michael. He literally left and started Anthropic because he said, this guy's dangerous. He doesn't care about guardrails. There's a bunch of other people who've done that as well. I think Ilyas Skaver is his name. A bunch of very senior technical people at OpenAI are like, this dude is really dangerous. Elon Musk said the exact same thing about Sam Altman. The famous Joe Rogan podcast, where Joe Rogan's saying, well, Sam Altman's, this guy, he just cares about humanity and the species. And then Elon Musk was like, okay, check out what car he drives. And they, I think it's called a Koenigsberg.
It's a really fancy car.
Most expensive electric car, I think, in the world at the time, like hundreds of thousands of dollars. He's like, okay, if you believe that, good for you. And I'm, rare example of me really strongly agreeing with Elon Musk.
Yeah, Ilyas Skaver was part of it. So in OpenAI, there was an attempted coup against Sam Altman, which was led by the effective altruists.
Yes.
So that is a very sort of powerful social group in Silicon Valley. Helen Toner was her name. She was on the board, and the sort of effective altruist on the board tried to get rid of him. He fought back. He won, essentially. Before we wrap up, because we've been sort of talking big picture. this is a big story. The jobs are going. What's it going to look like in the future? I definitely think that's all relevant. In the short term, there is a counter argument to that which I began the segment to suggest that actually maybe it isn't AI taking away entry-level jobs. So this was a piece earlier in the month by John Byrne-Murdoch and Sarah O'Connor at the Financial Times. And they say that two of the data points used as evidence for the theory that AI is already taking entry-level jobs are misleading. So the argument, sort of as we put forward at the start, unemployment began rising when ChatGPT was launched. Therefore, it's ChatGPT causing the unemployment. The second one being youth unemployment has risen more than general unemployment. Therefore, it is these entry-level jobs which are particularly being harmed. They say that actually, if you look at actual adverts for new jobs, these arguments don't necessarily stack up. It might be a mirage. So on the timing, they write this. When we look at hiring for junior and senior positions in our 5 countries, the decline begins not in November, December 2022 as ChatGPT came online, but in mid-2022 as interest rates rapidly climbed. This looks like a hiring slowdown in response to worsening financial conditions, not AI. So saying the timing, yes, the jobs are already going before ChatGPT was launched. What actually precipitated that was the hike in interest rates, which you referred to earlier, Aaron. Then this was the bit that I thought was very interesting, very intuitive, where they're sort of throwing cold water on the idea that youth unemployment means that it's entry-level jobs which are going. And they say, not necessarily the case. And once you hear this, you'll think, oh, of course, that makes sense. So they say, the respective slowdowns in hiring for entry-level and experienced positions show very little difference. This is a cooling of hiring across the board, not a particular reluctance to hire juniors. And they say, how can this be, given that we know it is youth unemployment that is spiking especially high? And the answer is, an economy-wide hiring freeze will always show up as rising youth unemployment, since older workers simply remain in place, i.e. in work, whereas new labour market entrants have nowhere to go. When I read that, I was like, of course. You can't look at the line saying youth unemployment is going up and suggest that that means that graduate jobs are being particularly destroyed. It's just that it's young people who are looking for work. So you won't notice if you're an older person that hiring across the board has fallen. Well, you most likely won't notice as an older person because you already have a job, whereas you really will notice as a younger person because you don't have a job. So after 2008, it would have also been youth unemployment, which massively increased, because if there's a hiring freeze, it's young people who end up unemployed because they don't already have a job.
I was in a big Tesco the other day, Michael, in Pompey, the front lines of blue-collar Britain. Giant Tesco in Portsmouth. Beautiful Portsmouth. And
we don't have big Tesco's where I live, only really small ones.
Well, it's London, isn't London? Yeah. The Tesco Metro, little, small ones. And the interface, the great cafe, they've built a new cafe there, and it was like McDonald's. You have the interface, you order the food, and it was a level of capital infrastructure which I was just kind of like, okay, this is kind of weird. The idea that a Tesco in Portsmouth would have this. And of course, there are still people working there, but it's not as many people as were working in the same kind of business 5-10 years ago. And they all would have been either economic migrants or kids, young people, students, right? Another one, in my pharmacy recently, I just go for a prescription. I'm an asthmatic, have some inhalers. I sit down and there's like a black window just to the side of where they're working. I'm thinking, what's that? There are robotic arms, logistical robotic arms. Yeah, just like an Amazon logistics warehouse, moving things around so people order up the medication and it gets it. And again, that probably means they don't hire 1 or 2 people. So general purpose robotics, digitization, you don't need AI for that stuff to be taking lots of jobs away. And I do think for now, it's just nibbling at the edges, right? It's not huge numbers, but those are the places where kids would get their start. So I do think it's real, and I do think technology is having an impact on white collar jobs, but also, what are often called unskilled entry-level jobs for young people. I think it's happening on both areas, and ignore it at your peril.
Briefly, so on how we respond to productivity gains, this was a separate debate which was going on Twitter today, but I thought was very interesting. Nonetheless, Olivier Blanchard is former chief economist at the IMF. So at the moment, there are lots of people on X, American policy people, politics people, who are constantly saying, America's really successful, Europe sucks, we're rich, you're poor. Olivier Blanchard, very, very mainstream economist, probably one of the most famous sort of neoliberal economist really in the world. He tweeted, "The French are not lazy. They just enjoy leisure time more than most. No irony here. And this is perfectly fine. As productivity increases, it is perfectly reasonable to take it partly as more leisure, fewer hours per week, earlier retirement age, and only partly in income." Aaron, amen to that?
Amen. And also people say Britain is wealthier than France, has a higher GDP per capita. That's because we work longer. So France has made the political decision to have a lower GDP per capita because they work less. If they worked as much as us, they'd have a higher GDP per capita because their productivity is high. Amen to that. And I think, this obsession with growth, I would like an obsession with productivity. Let's work smart, not hard.
I agree. Let's wrap up there. On the theme of not working too hard, we won't go more than 5 minutes over our allotted time. Thank you guys for watching this evening. Aaron Bastani, pleasure to have you in the studio with me.
Can I say one thing?
You must.
A ton of people in the comments are saying, there's a great guy called Cory Doctorow. There's a great person called Yanis Varoufakis. They talk about this. I spoke to both of them on Downstream. So if you want to see more about techno-feudalism or Cory Doctorow or Karen Howe on the perils of AI, we have some great videos here on our YouTube channel.
They're three of the most popular ever, I think, aren't they? Cory Doctorow,
right.
Karen Howe, and Yanis Varoufakis. So do check them out. I mean, you've probably already checked them out because, as I've just said, they're some of the most popular videos on YouTube. Come back tomorrow for another live stream at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.